Live from one Shadow Lane in Casco, Maine. It's the Early Bird Show with your host, Ray Plummer.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Early Bird Show. I am your host, Greg Plummer, coming to you live from the Raymond Casco Historical Society. And this evening's program is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be discussing the historic and oftentimes troubled Babb's Bridge, which spans the Presumpscot River between the towns of Windham and Gorham. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to the self-proclaimed steward of Babb's Bridge, Mr. Gary Plummer. How are you, sir?
Hi, Greg.
Pleasure.
Good to meet you.
Pleasure meeting you. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You bet. Hey, are we related?
Are you sure you want to know that?
I'm not saying.
I'm reluctant to get into genealogy just in case, you know. But I expect we are, because my grandfather moved out of East Raymond in 1910 and built the house that I live in on Route 202 in Wyndham.
No kidding.
So I expect we're probably cousins.
I was just going to say, you know, it's never too late to put me in your will.
Well, usually people say that when they see my 65 Mustang convertible. They want me to will that to them.
Oh,
But,
nice. 65 convertible, huh?
Oh, yeah.
Sweet. I got a 1970 GTO.
Oh, wonderful. Those were good years.
We
for the
could go
GTO.
cruising here
Yes,
at some
we
point
can.
in time, right? Well, before I want to get into Babb's Bridge, I want to know a little bit more about Gary Plummer. So, are you from Windham?
I am from Windham. I lived in Windham all my life. I lived just up the street with my mother and father, and I bought my grandparents' house and remodeled that, so I'm right on the same property I grew up in Windham.
And what year were you born?
I was born in 1946.
1946.
Went to Windham schools, graduated from Windham High School in 1964.
Okay. All right. Now, do you have any early childhood memories of Babb's Bridge?
Well, you know what's interesting for me? The bridge was there.
Yeah.
You know, we drove through it. My mother's parents lived in White Rock, and every Friday night we went to White Rock, and you either went Sand Hill, across the Gambo Bridge, or you went to Covered Bridge. So I remember driving through the bridge as a young child. It was kind of neat, you know, to have the bridge kind of envelop you as you drove through,
Sure.
but not anything really special. And then growing up, it was there. As kids, we didn't swim at the bridge. I know in the 70s and 80s, a lot of the kids did, but we swam at Dundee. But to get to Dundee, you drove through the Covered Bridge. So it was always there. It was a neat structure, but I didn't think a lot of it. I don't think I really appreciated it when I was a younger fella.
So now you are, you know, the self-proclaimed steward, but now you're officially the steward of the bridge. We'll get to that eventually.
Okay.
But, you know, let's dive into the history of the bridge a little bit. When was the bridge built?
Well, the bridge was built in 1840 or 1843. Or 1860, or 1863.
That's one of those things, huh?
Ironically, there are two dull histories of Windham, and neither one of them mentioned the bridge. I mean, it was like it was there, but it wasn't historic when those were written. Nobody can accurately pinpoint the year it was built. Maine Department of Transportation uses 1840. And I'm going to stick with 1840, and I learned a long time ago from a historian, if you say it enough times, it becomes true.
People are going to buy it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And do we know who built the bridge?
Most of the covered bridges were probably built by local farmers, local people. They harvested the timber from nearby and built the bridge. And this wasn't the first bridge across the river. There were other bridges there. There's a little bit in history about one of them that burned, and another one that floated down the river in a freshet. But eventually they decided to build the covered bridge.
Now, why were they building covered bridges back then? Was there a philosophy behind building a covered bridge versus you're just an uncovered bridge, I guess?
It was the practicality of it. They built bridges out of wood. You know what happens to wood when the weather gets to it.
Yeah.
And the bridge would rot away in a few years. So by putting a roof over it, and most of them have a roof, some have full sides, some have partial sides, but by putting a roof over it, it protected the underpinning, and it would last for a long time. And as we know from this bridge, it did last for a long time.
Sure, I think too, like a lot of people did traveling during the winter months. I think that's something that a lot of people don't understand is they would roll the roads out, pack down the snow, and there was, people had sleighs back then, and so what did they do in regards in the wintertime with that? Did they do anything particular with the covered bridge during the wintertime or no?
Well, actually, there are records in some of the old town reports. They paid people to shovel snow into the bridge.
Into the bridge.
And that would make the board slippery enough so the runners on the sleighs were generally metal.
Yeah.
And it would let them slide a little better on the wood across the bridge. So, yeah, they shovel snow into the bridge in the winter so the sleighs could pass through easily.
No kidding. Now, was it always called Babb's Bridge?
No. Actually, originally it was called the Hurricane Bridge.
Okay.
There's some stories on that, but the Hurricane Road is the road on the Gorham side. So it was originally called the Hurricane Bridge. Sometime around the 1880s, the name was adopted Babb's Bridge for a local family that lived close by.
Oh, okay. Now, were they Windham family or Gorham family?
Actually, the family was a Gorham family, but the fellow from Gorham married a Windham woman from across the bridge from Windham. So, they occupied, they took care of both sides of the bridge.
Yeah, they probably fostered their love on that bridge.
Well, they may have.
Now, okay, now we're going to fast forward a little bit because there's a checkered past to Babb's Bridge. We know this, Now, do you remember where you were in 1973?
Yes, I do. Okay. I was in my house on my farmhouse on Route 202 in Windham, and I was out working in the garden, and somebody pulled in the yard. I don't even remember who it was, but said, "Did you know the bridge burned last night?" And I, "What do you mean the bridge burned? Is it okay?" Or, "No, there's nothing left." Well, I says, "I guess I need to go look." So I jumped in my truck and drove over to the bridge. And the timbers, the skeleton was there.
Yeah.
And the timbers were still smoking. And I stood there, several other people there, and it was kind of the atmosphere of a funeral for somebody, really important. Nobody was talking, but you knew everybody was in mourning for the bridge. So yes, I remember exactly where I was.
What time of year did this happen?
This was May of 1973. May 6th, the bridge burned. It would have been the 7th that I went over.
And this was done by vandals?
They did eventually prosecute a couple of young fellows. I don't know that they intentionally planned to burn the bridge, but I think they thought it would be fun to light a tire on fire in the middle of the bridge.
What the hell did they think was going to happen?
We found out.
Yeah, I guess so. So the bridge burns down in 1973.
Yes.
What was the talk around town after that? There must have been some people that said, "Hey, we need to rebuild this historic landmark," because at this point in time, Babb's Bridge was the oldest covered bridge in the state of Maine, correct?
That's correct.
And then there must have been some other people like, "Nope, let's just put a steel bridge in there." So what happened after it burnt down in 73?
Well, and the first thing, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Bailey Bridge, but the military metal bridges, they brought one of those in and dropped it across the river so that you could drive across.
Okay.
And then the conversation was on. Maine Department of Transportation had talked about replacing it with a modern bridge, a steel and cement bridge. And most of us, I guess, thought that was the way it was going to go, but Windham and Gorham, who of course are historically rivals, in sports and so on,
Sure.
But it brought Windham and Gorham together, the historical societies. Wait a minute, there's been a bridge there for a long, long time, covered bridge, and we should have a covered bridge. And I wasn't involved in that, but my understanding is initially DOT kind of blew them off, saying, "Oh, well, we're not going to build another covered bridge." But the groups were persistent, and they worked with their legislators and convinced the DOT with certain conditions. The towns had to put money into it. In fact, I understand Cumberland County put some money into the covered bridge, and they got together. All the timber was cut locally. It was sawed in Gorham, moved to another place in White Rock where it was all planed and so on. And so I'm told all the lumber was produced locally, although the DOT engineer tells me that the floor stringers were actually Douglas fir. Oh, yeah. And they used Douglas fir, and we'll probably get into that in a little bit. But I was not really involved at the time. I was a young guy. I had all kinds of other things going on. Sure. And, you know, the old people were taking care of the historical societies. And wait a minute, old people? Well, anyway. And I don't know whether you want to get into the reopening or if you have a question on that or not.
No, so who did the rebuild in '73?
There was a combination of local folks, and apparently DOT was afraid of liability, so they all had to sign a waiver that they, you know, if they got hurt or whatever, that they wouldn't press charges against the state.
Typical red tape.
And but I wasn't involved. I wasn't going to the bridge every week like I do now. Yeah. And so I remember, you know, the historical record tells about how they worked on it and so on. So I really can't tell you who all the workers were, but I know some of the names. They were local names of people who worked getting the materials together and convincing the state that it would be a good idea to put another covered bridge there. So
when did that project finish? When did the bridge reopen?
Well, coincidentally, July 4th, 1976 was the 200th anniversary of the United States of America. So they planned the completion to happen and open on that date. Nice. I did happen to go to that. I was a young fellow, but I'd got elected somehow to the Windham Town Council, and they invited us all. And it was a fabulous celebration. They had reenactors there, and they had people singing and people dressed in costume, and people climbing a put together stage, people climbing up and talking about how great things were and so on. So I do remember, you know, that opening, but there again, after that, the bridge was there.
That's it. So now we're at 1976. The bridge is kind of living its life, okay? You're living your life parallel to the bridge, right?
Absolutely.
Now, we fast forward to 2014, and this might kind of go in. Is this where you kind of became the self-proclaimed steward of Babb's Bridge right around 2014? What happened in 2014?
Well, and I can't say if it was 2014, 2013, 2012, but over the years, the bridge was deteriorating, at least in part because the kids would kick boards off the side so they could jump in the river. And they had great fun doing it.
Sure.
But it wasn't good for the bridge. Then with the advent of battery-operated saws, someone cut a hole in the roof of the bridge, and they would climb up the support pole and out onto the roof of the bridge and jump. And people complained, and DOT came down and put a piece of plywood over the hole. And I looked at it and says, is that the repair for the bridge? And about that same time, people from the Windham Historical Society were observing that the bridge was in tough shape.
Sure.
And needed something done. And I was reading posts on email and so on about the bridge, and Walter Lamb posted, well, somebody needs to do something. And I'm sitting in front of the computer, and all of a sudden I see a reflection of myself in front of the computer. Wait a minute. Am I the one that's supposed to do this?
That's me.
Well, I was finishing up my legislative tenure, and I said, well, I'm going to have time. Maybe I should take this on. So I started making calls to Department of Transportation, and I'd call every week, sometimes a couple times a week. I'd like to think that my skills at convincing them were good, but I think really what it was is they just got tired of me calling all the time, and they said, "Okay, we'll do something."
Just stop calling.
We had a meeting at the bridge with Gorham Town Manager, Gorham Public Works, Windham Town Manager, Windham Public Works, myself, and DOT officials.
Yeah.
And we talked about doing it. At that time frame, it appeared that the granite blocks on the Windham side had moved. And it's, how could the granite blocks move? Well, what happened is there was an opening between the bridge and the abutment, and water got down in there and froze and pushed those blocks. And there was some concern as to whether they could actually secure the blocks, and I kind of got involved and went over and peeked at it while they were doing it, and it was like a big machine pumping grout, a cement substance, in the cracks in the blocks. And they were successful. They got the blocks so they wouldn't move.
This was on the Windham side or the
This
Gorham?
was on the Windham side. The Gorham side never moved, but it never moved because the water never got down in there.
Right.
And I'm pretty vigilant about making sure that if a crack opens up, that they repair it before the water gets down in there. I was expecting them to put a new roof on the bridge and patch the boards on the side. They actually came in and they removed all the boards on the roof, left the rafters, but removed all the boards on the roof, removed all the boards on the side, and they started by putting 3/4-inch plywood on the sides, and then they put the boards, vertical boards on top of that. So from the outside it looks all original. If anybody goes inside and looks, wait a minute, I don't think they had plywood in 1840. They might figure it out. And then on the roof, they actually put the boards, the vertical boards on the roof first, put the plywood on, and then put the wooden shingles on. And of course the plywood gives it more stability and makes it harder to punch a hole in it.
Right.
So they did a remarkable job. Records show that they spent about $160,000. My recollection is it was closer to $189,000, including the grouting and all that. But they had a company that did tremendous work. I'd go over to the bridge every week, sometimes a couple times a week, and I'd talk with the guys, and I said, look, I'm curious. I want to follow the reconstruction. But if I'm in the way, tell me to get my tail out of the way. And they were all good, and they really took pride in the work they were doing. It was obvious. They took time to show me what they were doing and how they were doing it. So it was quite a process, and I was very pleased. And I'm not sure if people realize, but in the early 70s, I believe, the state legislature passed a law that all the remaining covered bridges in Maine fall under Department of Transportation. Before that, it was the towns of Windham and Gorham, and at one point, I think they were fighting over where the line was, trying to move the line into one town or the other, so the other town had to spend the money to repair the bridge.
And how many covered bridges were there in the state?
At one time, it is estimated there were about 150 covered bridges in the state of Maine. Right now, there's a lot less than that.
Yeah.
A couple of years ago, the number was at 9, but the covered bridge in Aroostook County burned. So now there are 8 remaining covered bridges in the state of Maine. If people are interested in where they are, go Google covered bridges, Maine DOT, and they have a list and a description of each one.
That's interesting. Yeah, so 2014, the repairs get made.
Yes.
And you're there throughout the process. And was there any grand reopening to the bridge at that point in time, or?
There really wasn't. I think everybody was anxious to get it done and get it open, and let's do it. So there really wasn't.
Now, was the bridge still on the registry at this point in time?
The bridge had been put on the National Historic Register. I'm not sure exactly when it went on, but my involvement with the Historic Register came a little bit later when I got a call and said, you know, they're going to take Babb's Bridge off the National Historic Register. I called and got in touch with the historian from Maine, and he kind of said, we don't have any choice. It has to be 50 years old, and it's only 47 years old, so it can't be on the Historic Register. So that was kind of the story of that. But yes, it was, and it was on as the oldest covered bridge in the state of Maine.
No kidding, but now it's not.
Well, now it's not, but if you do the math, if the bridge was reopened, built in 1976, in 2026, it'll be 50 years old. Guess who's going to be clamoring for putting it back on the National Historic Register?
I love it, Gary. I love it. I like the persistence. This is a good place to take a little break and get a word from our sponsors.
Good enough.
All right, we'll be right back.
Thank you so much.
All right.
The Early Bird Show is brought to you by...
If your truck falls in the river because you don't know where you're going, just call Phillips & Sons Body Shop in Towing. That's 207-839-4975. 207-839-4975. And posted bridge limit signs. It's not just a suggestion.
And we're back. And joining us right now is Mr. Walter Lunt, the educational liaison from the Windham Historical Society.
Hello, Greg.
Hello, Walter.
Thank you.
How are you, sir?
Very fine.
Good, good. So where we left off was 2014. Our friend Gary here was a pain in the ass to the DOT. got the job done though, didn't we? Is there anything that we need to add about the bridge back in 2014? How was it working with the DOT?
DOT was fantastic to work with. I hadn't always had a real high opinion of Department of Transportation, but my thought of that project, they did a great job. Then, and I probably should add, after they got all the work done, all the wood put on, I stood there looking at the bridge, and if people have been in covered bridges, somehow the bridges attract graffiti.
Sure.
And I think Windham probably had the most graffiti. Babb's Bridge had the most graffiti of any bridge in the state. So I got to know the people working on the bridge, the people in charge. So as they were completing the work, I went up and I said, well, one more thing. I said, what do you guys think about removing the graffiti from the inside of the bridge? The guy threw up his hand and said, no, we're done. And I was a little disappointed, but I called Bill Diamond, was our state senator at the time, and I called Bill and says, Bill, what do you think? Is there any way I can get some help with this? And he said, well, you know the Commissioner of Department of Corrections, give him a call, see if they'd send some people from the correctional center over. And I did, and I was pleasantly surprised, and they made arrangements. The conditions were that I had to pick out the stain to cover over the graffiti, and that I had to be there all the time they were working, direct traffic, so that the workers didn't get run over.
Sure.
And I volunteered to do that. Little did I know I had to sign my life on the line that no matter what happened, I wouldn't sue the Department of Transportation, but that's okay. And they sent a crew of 4 women and the supervisor, and they worked on the bridge all day one day. And usually they told me they don't send the same crew to the same site 2 days in a row. I think it's a security kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But these women had such a great time that they wanted to come back the second day, so they let them come back the second day. And I was impressed. They had ladders. Of course, the bridge is, 12, 13 feet high inside.
Sure.
And I remember one of the women coming down off the ladder and looking back up and say, oh, I missed a spot, going back up. I mean, they really took pride in what they were doing. And interestingly enough, someone came and they identified themselves as from Virginia, and they were only going to be there that day. They'd like to take a picture. And I talked to the supervisor from DOC, and he said, we can't have the prisoners in any pictures. I says, well, can we move them out? Oh, sure. So they moved the workers away so they wouldn't get in the picture, and let them take the picture, and went back to work. And people were fantastic. You know, I'm out there stopping traffic. They give me a little vest to put on. And people were really good about it, and were appreciative that, you know, the bridge was being taken care of. The only real complaint, one woman pulled up, and I stopped her, and it says, it'd just be a few minutes. They're working inside the bridge. She says, well, my tea time's in 20 minutes, and I've got to get there. Give me a minute. We'll get them out of the way, and you can get through.
Yeah.
But it was a great experience, you know, getting to chat with people and so on. And after that was done, DOT left me a little bit of the stain, and we have, let's say, we have a small crew.
Yeah.
That anytime there's any graffiti, gets the paint out, gets a brush out, and covers it right over. And I think that's helped reduce the incidents.
Sure.
I think if there's graffiti there, people walk in and say, well, I guess it's okay to do, and do their own. And it's been maybe 3, 4, 5 times a year that there's been something. Yeah. But it's been...
let that be a lesson to everyone. Don't even try it.
No, don't try it, because the marshal will be on site and fix it.
That's right. You have to be dealing with Gary if you try that.
I can add just a little bit to that. Over the years, we've been taking children to visit various historic sites in Windham, Babb's Bridge being one of them. And I can recall those years before Gary took over as unofficial and official steward, that it was a bit embarrassing taking classes of kids through the bridge, because what they were observing and somewhat appreciating was some of the off-color messages and pictures that were painted on the bridge. And over the years, they started really showing some concern about that. We often got thank you notes from the kids after we took them on these trips, and I just brought one of them with me. An amazing comment from one of the kids who said, you know, I really loved the trip. My favorite part was whatever, but my least favorite was the covered bridge, because I can't believe people would draw nonsense on history. At that point, we knew we could involve the kids in solving some of our problems.
That's pretty profound coming from a kid.
It is.
It really is.
It is. I've saved this forever.
These are third graders, 8-year-olds?
They are, correct.
From the mouths of babes.
Correct.
Sometime, you know. So let's move into August 23rd, 2024. What do you guys remember about that day?
Well, I was working around my farmhouse. I took a break and turned on the computer, and Patty Plummer, who's no relation, had posted somebody drove a truck through Babb's Bridge. And I said, well, they probably hit it and kicked the side out, like has happened in the past.
Right.
And then I get a text message from the president of the Windham Historical Society. Gary, do you know anything about what happened at the bridge? Well, I guess maybe I better get over there and see what's going on. I'm walking out the door. My daughter calls and says, Dad, they're talking about a truck going through the bridge. And I said, I'm on my way. So I'm 4 minutes away from the bridge. I drive up, and they've got the sign up, road closed. There's a Windham Public Works trucks there. And I said to the guy, do you think it's okay if I leave my truck here and walk down? He said, well, you can drive right down, just don't drive past the police cars. So I drove down, and as I'm coming down the hill towards the bridge, I see the bridge is still standing. It looks square. It looks like it ought to look from the outside. And I drive up, and they've got, probably 300 feet away, 100 yards. They've got a crime scene tape up, and nobody's allowed to go any closer. And there's several people, officials standing around, a couple of police officers. One of them approached me and says, you're Gary Plummer, aren't you? He says, you used to be in the legislature. I said, yes, I am, but I'm here today representing the Historical Society. Have you been down to the bridge? And he says, oh, yeah. And I says, can you tell me if the bridge is intact or what the damage is? And he said, you want to walk down? Well, sure I want to walk down.
Sure do.
So I walked down and took some pictures, and from the outside of the bridge, and there's a tape across the end of the bridge, and I said, well, I can't go any further. Well, the police officer lifted the tape up and let me walk in so I could take pictures looking down. And what a relief it was to stand next to that hole and see the main timbers across the bridge are all straight and true. They haven't moved. The floor stringers broke, and the truck just dropped right down into the river.
So was this a dump truck?
This was a dump truck. It was an F-750.
Okay.
It had just left the pit and went over the scales, and one report was 38,000 pounds, but the official was 36,000 pounds.
And what's the capacity of Babb's Bridge?
Which is 3 tons, 6,000 pounds.
So he's a little off right
It was
there.
at least 6 times overweight, you know.
Oh, my Lord.
One would assume someone would know. I shouldn't really drive across that bridge, but
Right.
this young fella apparently didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm looking down at the truck, and I know my first thought should have been, gee, I hope the guy's all right. But I have to confess, my first thought was, thank God it didn't do more damage than it did.
The bridge can be rebuilt.
The bridge is fixable. There's no question in my mind standing there.
He was all
looking
right,
at it.
wasn't he?
He was all right.
Minor
He said he
injuries?
had minor injuries,
Yeah, okay.
and he freed himself and got out of the truck.
Yeah.
And then, even though that should have at least been my second thought was, how in the world are they going to get that truck back up through the hole?
Right.
It made a nice little hole when it went down through. I say little, it was, not little.
Dump
but
truck size.
Dump trucks, yeah. And what happened apparently is when his front wheels hit the bridge and the weight came on, the floor stringers gave way and he just dropped head first right down into the river, and then the truck flopped over on its roof or bed.
Oh, okay. So what, did it go ass end first or it go cab first?
It went cab first
Okay.
and then flip.
Okay. Wow, holy smokes.
So
You
I'm
must have been
concerned, how are they going to get that thing out of the river?
Right, you must have been thinking that's gonna take a lot of stain to fix that.
Well, and my thought was, are they going to do a lot more damage to the bridge trying to pull it up through that hole?
Right. So what? Jesus. So what was the process of getting that truck out of there?
Well, and I can retell the story, but it's secondhand. Susie Phillips, who's president of the Gorham Historical Society, tells a pretty decent story. But the story is that people were standing around and trying to figure it out. And someone says, who's the next wrecker on rotation? And the fire chief says, don't bother, call Carl Phillips. He's the only one that's got a wrecker big enough to pull that truck out. And Carl happens to be Susie's father-in-law, and she was there at the shop.
Yep.
She heard it all on scanner and told him he was going to get a call. Soon as he got the call, he called a buddy of his with another wrecker, and they met at the bridge. And there was quite a bit of discussion. I mean, everybody had an opinion on how it should be done. And they're all standing around talking about how it should be done. Carl made the decision that with one wrecker, they'd pull the truck up. And then with the other wrecker, they'd move it upstream where they could get it out. And Susie tells a story that someone, one of the firemen, looked at Carl and says, don't you think you ought to tow that truck across the river and take it out on the Windham side? And she says, Carl looked at him, and Carl's not a young fella. Carl looked at him and says, this is my truck. I've been doing this a long time. I'll do it my way.
I'm going to do it my way.
And his way
I respect
worked out
that.
real well. It came up out of there. It left minor ruts where it came up. They removed unbolted the guardrail, and the truck was out of the river with no more damage to the bridge, and no real environmental damage. And apparently it was rock that he was hauling, and they determined that wasn't going to hurt anything, so that's still on the bottom of the river.
Now, did they get a fine or something for being overweight? Or
They did. Apparently the driver got a $2,500 fine.
$2,500? What the hell is that going to cover?
Yeah. And the company did issue an apology, and they'd like to do whatever they could to make it right. I don't know that their insurance company is paying. So, but you know, it was one of those things. But there's the bridge with a gaping hole in it. DOT put up plywood across the ends to keep people out, and the bridge set that way.
That's okay. So now that brings us back to the rebuild of the bridge. Now, did you play a role in the rebuild of the bridge? How did that happen? How did that unfold, if you will?
I did. I worked with Susie. Susie is not only Gorham Historical Society, she's Gorham Town Council. And I worked with her, and I worked with Bob Burns, who's the assistant town manager in Windham, because I knew Bob from when he was Public Works Director in Gorham. So I worked with the two of them and got a name of the bridge engineer, and I called him, and he was very pleasant, and talked about the plan, and they had been down, looked over the bridge, and said, yes, it could be repaired. And I was delighted to hear that, because some people will say, oh, no, they're just going to say, tear it down and put up a modern bridge. But I didn't hear any of that from DOT. I was pleased. Very cooperative, but they were reluctant to set a timeline. I mean, when I looked at it, and probably I was optimistic, I said, you know, 2 or 3 guys who knew what they were doing could have that hole repaired in 2 weeks. But, you know, that wasn't, when you involve government, sometimes it takes a little longer.
Yeah, it doesn't necessarily move fast at that point.
So yeah, I was involved. I made calls, and the best they would offer is we could have it repaired in the spring. I did inquire if they were going to bid the job, and they said, no, we don't need to. This is something we have snowplow truck drivers, and they're good guys, and they can do the work. My first thought was, snowplow truck drivers?
What do they know about
working on a historic bridge?
Yeah.
But I'll tell you what, I followed the reconstruction. Great guys. I would trust them to build anything, anytime, and do it in a timely fashion.
Fantastic.
So I don't know how much detail you want me to get into in terms of the process, but
oh, feel free.
Well, as I told you when the bridge was rebuilt, I did the same thing with these guys. I drove over, got out and introduced myself, and said, look, if I'm in the way, tell me to get out of your way, and I will. But I'd like to follow the process, and I'd like to get some pictures. And they were great. They were great guys to talk with, and I went back a couple times a week. I knew if it was snowing, they wouldn't be there.
Sure.
But I tried to time it, and sometimes it would be just the bridge all boarded up, and sometimes it would be the crew working. And the holdup was that the bridge engineer told me that the floor stringers had to be Douglas fir, and that's not a local timber.
No.
Now, if you read reports, it said when the bridge was rebuilt in mid-70s that it was done with all local timber. And I brought this up with the bridge engineer, and he says, I got the specs right here, and I'm telling you, we're using Douglas fir. I said, oh, okay. And that was a process. It had to be bid, and it has to come from down south.
Yeah.
The rest of the stuff was all available locally, the spruce and so on.
Wouldn't you think that the original bridge was made out of hemlock?
It was, and what I'm told, and I can't verify this, but what I'm told is in the 1800s, our local timber was much denser and therefore stronger.
Yeah.
And either the guy pretended he was knowing what he was saying, or he really did.
It was convincing.
But it was convincing. So that was the explanation for why. Yeah, I assume the original bridge was all built out of hemlock. I don't assume they hauled up stuff from Georgia
No.
to do the original bridge.
So they said that the bridge was going to be done in the spring of 2025, but here we are, and the bridge is opened up. And the bridge reopened on February 20th, correct?
That is correct. I just happened to pull down in to observe the bridge, and we can get into what happened next if you want.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Well, I pulled up, and the cement barricades are gone. The plywood's no longer across the bridge, but the portable barricades are in front of the bridge. And I walked down. You could walk around them. I went in, took a few pictures of the bridge, looked up, and another vehicle pulled up. It happened to be a local neighbor, Wendy Haskell, who just lives up the street. And she and I chatted for a few minutes. And while we're talking, a Department of Transportation truck pulled up. The guy gets out, and I went over and chatted with him. He recognized me because he'd been there and I had been. And I said, can you give me any idea when the bridge will reopen? He looked at his watch and says, give me about 10 minutes and you can be the first one to drive through the bridge.
How fitting is that?
Just happenstance. I just happened to be there, and it all worked out well. And I have got nothing but praise for the way it worked. I think probably the spring was, well, just in case we don't get to it any sooner,
Right.
kind of thing.
Well, it's hard to predict the weather.
Yeah, and we did have a decent winter. I mean, I was over there on days when the temperature was single numbers and they were still working. I said, you know, don't they give you a heater or something? Guy says, well, if it gets really cold, they do.
Yeah.
But I took all kinds of pictures, and I started to get really excited when the last of the flooring went down. And just to back up a little, the top layer of boards used to be called running boards, but that's the layer you drive on, and that's what wears. And in the old days with the steel wagon wheels, they'd wear somewhat quicker and wear ruts, and they'd have to replace them. The boards had been there since 1976, and I kept thinking, well, should I lobby to have those replaced? But I said, well, they'll do another couple, 3 years. Well, DOT made the decision while they had the bridge closed and torn apart, they would replace all of the floor stringers, floorboards, which they did, which was all native spruce. They also surprised me. There's what's called false doors, and as you enter the bridge on both sides, on both ends, there are vertical boards that look like doors that could be closed, but they can't.
Sure.
They're nailed right in place, and they're decorative. And somebody questioned, why waste money on those things if you don't need them? Well, they're historic. That's what the original bridge had, so that's what they did. So one of the last times before the bridge was opened, I went, and there's a guy in nailing, got a power nailer, nailing the floor boards down, and I say nails, they're spikes that are 8 inches long or so.
Right, yeah.
And I'm watching him, and I said, well, I'd like to get a picture of that. I said, you probably don't want me taking a picture of your backside, your butt, while you're doing that. He says, go ahead, that's my best side. So I got a picture of that, and things are just great. People are driving across the bridge. I can't tell you how many times I've read on Facebook, oh, we went down to the bridge last night to just drive across it. Oh, my granddaughter had never been across the bridge, so we took her down and rode through the bridge. So
Yeah, that's awesome.
it is.
That's great. So I need you guys to tell me what's going on March 12th. What do we have going on?
Well, apparently the Windham Public Library has asked Gary to present a program on everything you've just seen, a bit of the history of the bridge and about the two major repair times, the mid-70s and the current one. So we'll be at the Windham Public Library in the public room downstairs, and we'll have some PowerPoint pictures and a couple of guests, and Gary will make a presentation similar to what you've just heard.
6:30 p.m. on March 12th at
Correct.
Windham Public Library on Windham Center Road.
I love it. Gentlemen, do you have anything else to add?
Well, I mentioned the education component that we have with Windham Public Schools with the children. When Gary and I went through Windham Public Schools, Windham history was taught in the 8th grade. Since then, the local history strand of their social studies curriculum has moved to 3rd grade. It's a pretty wonderful group to work with. The schools asked the Historical Society to contribute anything we might have to that, and there's about 200 3rd graders going through Windham Public Schools now. 7, 8, sometimes 9 classes every year, but we have enough volunteers to work with them. So one of the things we do is to take them on a school bus trip to visit 8 or 9 historic places in Windham. So that might be an old church, the Parson Smith House, the site of the last battle of the French and Indian War down on Anderson Road, and Windham Hill, the gunpowder mill at Gambo. I can tell you from the letters we get after this trip that usually the covered bridge is their favorite place. I did that trip for 14 years. We now have a young fellow by the name of Jason Farley who takes the kids on this trip every spring. And the stories, the education he's able to impart with them at the bridge is fascinating and entertaining. I'll share a couple of those with you. When we have the program on March 12th, Jason will join Gary to talk about his work with the kids. But I've been with him a few times, and he tells 3 or 4 stories that are fascinating. And there are always adult chaperones with us, and we hear back from them. They love this trip every bit as much as the kids do. First of all, the bridge has always had many names. Gary mentioned Hurricane Bridge. We know it as Babb's Bridge. When Jason introduces the kids to the bridge, first they walk through it. They stand on the Gorham side and just talk about the bridge. And Jason calls it the Kissing Bridge. You know, you need things to keep attention to 8 and 9-year-olds.
Absolutely.
And so he usually introduces it that way. So how do you like the Kissing Bridge? And what do you mean?
Ew.
He said, well, back in the day, he says, well, today if you're going steady with someone, you might exchange rings or something like that. But back in the day, it wasn't official that you were boyfriend, girlfriend until you visited the bridge and kissed on the bridge. And so that usually elicits a few giggles and so forth. But then he goes into other stories. He said, when we leave and go back to the school bus cannot cross the bridge. So the school bus remains on the Windham side. He said, but when we return to the bridge, here's something you might want to try. I don't know if it's true or not, but the story goes, if you draw a breath before entering the bridge and you're able to hold your breath until you get to the other side, your whatever wish you make will come true. So I can guarantee you, there's always 40 children on each one of these trips. And you watch 40 kids.
One of my favorite stories you've told is about people hiding in the timbers of the bridge. You want to tell that one?
I do. It's my favorite story. It's the one I always told the kids when I used to do the trip. Many years ago, I read a story, and I will tell you that covered bridges originate in New England. Between Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, we're talking about hundreds of covered bridges. We have 8 left in Maine, but there's 150 today between New Hampshire and Vermont. So obviously you get myths, legends, and stories that spring from the existence of the covered bridge. And one was the story of the highwayman robber, the highwayman. And the story goes that the highwayman, and we don't know that this happened in Windham. Actually, it probably did not. And I always explain that to the kids. We don't know if it really happened here at this bridge you're looking at. But somewhere it probably happened, because we read these stories now and then. Apparently, a robber rode his horse to the site of a covered bridge. Took his horse out into the woods where he tied it. Returned to the covered bridge and walked inside and climbed the side wall until he reached near the top, where he would wait for an unsuspecting buggy or carriage to drive through. At which time he would jump into the back of the buggy and holler, "Stand down." Well, the buggy would stop inside the bridge. The highwayman would rob them, send them on their way, return to his horse, and he was gone. Kids loved that story. And you know what they did? They went home that night, all 40 of them, and said it happened at Babb's Bridge. I can't tell you the emphasis I put on, we don't know if it really happened, but somewhere in New England, indeed, it did.
Yeah.
Jason also likes to tell the kids about the wedding that took place at Babb's Bridge. We know nothing about it, except he was presenting these stories at the bridge one day, and one of the kids raised their hand and said, "My aunt and uncle got married here." Where? On the bridge. Well, I can't imagine DOT or the local public works closing the bridge for a wedding, but somehow I guess they pulled off a wedding there at the bridge.
There's a little background there. I got a call from the police chief and said, "I've had a request to do this.
Oh.
What do you think?" And he said he was willing to send officers over to stop the traffic so they could get married. So it actually did
Amazing.
happen. They actually were married in the covered bridge.
Inside. All right, there we go. So, we can pass this on to the kids now.
Good.
We know it really. This one really did happen at Babb's
that's
Bridge.
fantastic.
So here's another name for it: the wedding bridge.
Oh, there you go. Well, I'm glad. I think we just figured something out right here too. About history, that is confirmed that the wedding that happened.
Indeed. Breaking news.
Breaking news right here on the early.
Right here on the Early Bird Show.
That's right.
Windham has always had a romanticized historic connection with this bridge. And I'm really proud to say that our public schools recognize that Windham has fascinating history that we can all learn from. There are a lot of preservationists in Windham, and we appreciate it to the fact that we put it into the schools. And if there's anything that's going to save history in any community, it will be starting out young and presenting this history to children.
I agree with that.
So,
100%.
And Walter and I have had the conversation before that if we give the young kids a good appreciation of the bridge, when they get older, they're a lot less likely to be the ones that vandalize the bridge. Or if they see somebody else doing it, they're a lot more likely to say, "Wait a minute, you can't do that." So
yeah, in a way, by giving the kids the education on the bridge, you're like raising the next generation of stewards.
That's the whole idea.
Yeah, that's what it is. Well, hey, on behalf of the Raymond Casco Historical Society, we'd like to thank you for all the hard work. We really do. We want to thank you, and I'm sure I can speak for the town of Windham and the town of Gorham. That's it's pretty special what you've done, like in regards to Babb's Bridge.
Well, and I'd like to thank you for having us. I was thinking early this morning, why in God's name did I volunteer to do this? But I'm glad I did. We appreciate your doing it. And people consider that I do a lot of work. I don't do work. It's a labor of love. Yeah. I love that bridge, and as long as I'm able to, I'll be right there protecting it, doing what I can for it.
Well, that's nice, Gary. I think that's what we need. It's just people in the community that have labors of love. All right, that's all we got for you guys on this special episode of the Early Bird Show. I'd like to thank Gary and Walter, and bye for now.
Yep. Good night. I don't know, maybe it's morning.